Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It is another just beautiful spring day out here, and I'm excited to dive into this forest and see what we see out here. If this is your first time joining us, this is a channel where we scour the forests of the Pacific Northwest in search of fungi. Along the way, we typically encounter plenty of foraging opportunities, and we always take time to admire the wondrous nature that surrounds and abounds out here on the trail. So thanks for coming along. If you're liking these videos, remember, hit that like button, subscribe, stay tuned. Let's jump in. Let's see what we see. And just up the trail here, we've got a mushroom that I've been seeing a lot of recently. This is the Amanita pantherinoides, commonly referred to as the Panther Cap. So this is the Pacific Northwest version of Amanita pantherina. If we zoom in and we take a close look here, we notice we've got these white little warts up here on this brown cap. These are the remnants of a universal veil, which if we dig down underneath, we'll see this little cup-like vulva cup structure that this thing was essentially birthed out of. A lot of these that I've been seeing recently are bigger. I've got a special fondness though for these little buttons that are just kind of beginning to peek their heads out into the world here. Just beautiful to look at. And on this one, we've got it on a little bit of a slope here where we're at the root base of a big old Doug fir. This is a great example of that cup or vulva structure. Now, we've talked about this one in recent videos, so I won't go into great detail here, but a lot of times this is confused with different mushrooms, especially in its youngest state. So before this breaks out of this universal veil, sometimes people will mistake this for a common puffball, which is, you know, a favorite edible mushroom. It goes without saying, very ill-advised to harvest and consume this one. There are an incredible number of toxicology reports and poisonings right here in the Pacific Northwest that circle back to this one. A lot of times dogs will succumb to this and actually sometimes result in fatalities, and then there are plenty of human poisonings as well. So super interesting to see, and one that, boy, I just think is a real beauty. I love seeing it every time I'm out here. Never once have I considered harvesting and consuming that. This one contains muscimol and ibotenic acid, all kinds of things that can do quite a bit of harm to us humans. So interesting to see, and I will note too that some different forms of wildlife I have seen consuming this. So interesting to think what their experience is like after consuming this. They seem to have no problem. But I, for one, opt not to, and I recommend that you keep your pets away from this one as well, but certainly fun to admire. It's the Panther Cap, Amanita pantherinoides. And although I was initially focused on these two little guys back here, as I moved further up the trail, I spotted a particularly stunning example of this Panther Cap, Amanita pantherinoides. Take a look at this. Just beautiful. Look at that speckling or those warts up there on the cap of this one. Now, I love seeing that. I feel like it adds so much here to the forest floor, like a little piece of art. Now, it's worth noting that just the other day I was on a trail run with a good buddy of mine, and I spotted a small little fruiting body of this same mushroom, Amanita pantherinoides, but it had none of these warts or these little white speckles up on the cap. So it was completely bare, just a shiny brown cap without any of the remnants of that partial veil present. So super interesting to see. This can take on a lot of different looks. And, you know, again, what we're really looking for when we're identifying Amanitas in general is the presence of this vulva or cup that it's born out of. So you can see how at a young state, this completely enclosed or encapsulated the entire mushroom. If I turn this over, we can see, look at that, annulus or ring. So this is sometimes referred to as a skirt or an annulus. This is the remnant of a partial veil that at a younger age covered these gills. As it grew and matured, it kind of broke through and shed this partial veil to expose that spore-bearing surface of the gills. And if we actually take a look back down the trail here at these younger specimens, we'll see a prime example of that earlier state when those gills are totally covered by that partial veil. So we see again that cup-like structure there, that's the vulva or the universal veil. And then as I turn this and we look underneath, we see that partial veil totally covering the gill structure there. So super interesting to see. This is definitely one of my favorites to kind of encounter or come across out here. Just a really cool mushroom that is abundant out here. So if you keep your eyes peeled, you're almost certain to see this. And what a beauty, right? So moving just up the trail here, see a really cool mushroom just off to the side of the trail here. This is one that we've featured in a recent video. Very interesting to see out here along the side of the trail. This is what's commonly referred to as the Petticoat Mottlegill, Panaeolus papilonaceus. And if you look at this, boy, it's got a really unique kind of margin around the outside edge of that cap. Sometimes it's referred to as being toothed, right? And I guarantee if we look down at the base of this, we're gonna find some sort of dung or manure. Let's see, oh yeah, and sure enough. So take a look. So this off at the side of the trail, this looks to be some horse manure. And I know that there are sometimes horses on the trails that I'm currently on. This is one that'll oftentimes show up in fields or pastures growing on cow manure or horse manure. I believe those are the two that are most often associated with this. And if I give this a little bit of a tug and we look underneath, and sure enough, there you can really see its substrate that it's growing from, that manure. So you'll also notice some dark gills underneath. So let me set this down and we'll get kind of a close-up here of the gills. So notice that sometimes, this is how this one gets its name, you'll get a mottled color on the gills that's kind of speckled or varying shades of dark brown and black and gray. So very cool to see out here. Again, that's the Petticoat Mottlegill, Panaeolus. And moving just up the trail here, see a mushroom that's catching my eye that's a fairly familiar sight out here. We notice this one's been out for quite a while. We can see it's curling up at the margin and splitting radially. We've also got slight umbo, or actually somewhat pronounced umbo, in the center of the cap. If we look down here, you see another one. You can see a very similar thing going on. So umbo in the center, this one obviously a little fresher, so it's not curled up at the margin. Down here, if I pull this up, give it a little tug, we take a look underneath, we see light gill color. Let's actually compare and contrast this. Let's take a look at this one that's been out here a little longer. So this is a good side-by-side comparison. We've got the same mushroom, one that's been out quite a bit longer than the other. We can see the gills have turned kind of a brownish, kind of leathery type color on the older specimen, whereas this one, pretty white. If I give this a sniff, well, it's not giving too much of an odor. Let me smell this one as well. Somewhat distinct, tough to describe on that one. I believe that what we're looking at here are examples of the Inocybe genus, the fiber caps. So these are good ones to avoid. These are toxic mushrooms that are quite common out here in the Pacific Northwest. I see them quite frequently. And good to just kind of be able to identify from this trail side. Not one that I seek out in particular, but one that's still fun to look at, fun to be able to positively identify out here. And again, very common. So that's the Inocybe genus. I'm guessing that this is likely a mushroom that's commonly referred to as the corn silk Inocybe or the corn silk fiberhead. Inocybe soraria, but tough to say for sure. There are a lot of these Inocybes that look fairly similar to one another. So tough to make any kind of definitive call, at least for me out here in the field, but that would be my best guess. Corn silk fiberhead or corn silk fiber cap. Cool to see. And just up here on the side of the trail, we've got a cool sight. Look at this guy. We've got a little bolete popping up. And boy, when I look at this, so, you know, obviously as it stands right now, this is kind of a brownish, almost like a little bit of a reddish hue cap. But here's what's interesting. So I've been observing a lot of these this spring that once they're out for a while, their look can kind of change somewhat dramatically. So I'm guessing that even though this doesn't look like it on the surface, my suspicion is that this is most likely what we refer to as the deep purple bolete. Xerocomellus atropurpureus. Let's go ahead, let's take a look underneath and see what we've got. I'm guessing a red stipe. Yeah, so we can see this is kind of faded, blown out. We can even see perhaps a little sign of mold or rot underneath there. So my suspicion is that had we seen this a week or two ago, it would have looked quite a bit different. It would have been a darker, much darker color up top. This is really soft and spongy too, to the touch. So this is part of that natural decay process for these deep purple boletes, is they can really kind of change color in their cap. Not only can it get a little bit cracked in age and look somewhat like Xerocomellus diffractus, but it can also kind of fade to this off brown color. Just the other day, I was out on a trail run and I saw a huge cluster of these, you know, really nice flesh. And they were similar to this. They were mature and the caps had actually all cracked. At first I thought it was Xerocomellus diffractus, the red cracking bolete, because of the appearance of the cap. But as I started to peel back and look at different stages of life, right? Because as I mentioned, there was a cluster or a really nice flush of these. So I was able to find them in different states or different ages. And that helped me to clearly determine that it was in fact the deep purple bolete as opposed to one of the other spring boletes that we could see out here. So that's my call on that based on recent experiences. Let me know if you're looking at this and you've got a differing opinion. But I can even see that texture that's kind of unique to that deep purple bolete, kind of that rough, bumpy texture. Again, the color isn't indicative at this stage, right? It's not what we would expect with this, but I'm quite sure that that's what we're looking at here. So interesting to see, cool to be able to recognize these in all different stages and ages. Interesting to see. Again, let me know if you've got a differing opinion. Let me know in the comments, but cool to see. So moving just up the trail here, just wanted to take a quick second to appreciate one of my absolute favorite trees out here in the forest. Take a look at this guy. Just a massive tree. This is what's commonly referred to as the Western Red Cedar, Thuja plicata. And this is just such an incredible tree. So now, while this one is not oftentimes associated with ectomycorrhizal mushrooms, it is a really important tree in this forest. And it has an incredibly long history of historical use. In fact, I've heard it said that for the tribes in the area here in the Pacific Northwest, this particular tree is noted as being the cornerstone of a lot of the cultures that existed here. And the reason why is that so many aspects or elements of just daily life in society were sourced from this exact tree. So not only was it a staple for building materials, but it was also used to create clothing, as well as, you know, huge dugout canoes. And it was also used in different medicinal capacities as well. So what would oftentimes happen this time of year, actually in the spring, folks would come up to these trees and they would make a horizontal cut in this bark. During the spring, the sap's flowing and you could actually take and with a little wedge tool, they could pry underneath that bark and pull up massive strips that would sometimes be 25 to 30 feet up the tree. They would then take that bark, dry it out, pound it, and kind of get the fibers out of that, which they would oftentimes use for their clothing. Now, it's worth noting that this tree is not, it's got an antifungal compound in it, and it's known for being super resistant to rot and decay. So that's one of the reasons that it's always had, a very high value both amongst indigenous peoples and present in construction and building. So this will last a really, really long time. And these trees can get absolutely massive. So I've heard that they can live to be over 1,000 years. And some of the biggest ones that are reported out on the Olympic Peninsula here in Olympic National Park are as big as 20 feet in diameter. So a more typical kind of max is around 10 feet, but these can, if the conditions are just right, they can get absolutely huge. So again, this isn't one that we typically associate with ectomycorrhizal mushrooms that we are oftentimes seeking out. Those are some of the choice edibles that we're after. Those are typically associated with this other tree right next to it, the Douglas fir. So this has really deep furrows in older age, and that one is definitely a greater friend to a lot of those ectomycorrhizal mushrooms that we're so oftentimes pursuing. But this tree is just magnificent. And, it's oftentimes referred to as the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. And, I've even heard it say that in some cultures and traditions, there was a belief that the energy of this tree was so great that you could gain power just by standing with your back to this or sitting quietly at the base of these trees. And even though that sounds a little crazy, I can't help but feel a sense of that every time that I'm standing at the base of one of these. These are just pretty awe-inspiring trees that I love spending time with out here. And this one, so, obviously it's not 20 feet in diameter, but I will say that it would take at least 3 of me to wrap my hands around this guy, maybe 4. Just a massive, massive tree right here off the side of the trail. So super cool to see. And, it goes without saying that these have been, over harvested historically. So when you're visiting the old growth forests here in Western Washington, a lot of times all that you'll see of old growth cedar are these massive, massive stumps that were logged. And oftentimes you'll see like a little cut or divot in the base that they would actually stand on and then use that cross-cut saw to drop these massive trees. Ironically, those stumps that are, maybe were logged 100+ years ago are oftentimes still harvested today. So they call these people shake rats that will go seek out that old growth stumps, and they'll actually still harvest the wood that remains at the trunk. And even though it's been cut, oftentimes long ago, that wood is still valuable in the marketplace as shingles because of the fact that, a lot of the other kind of typical manufactured shingles might last, a couple decades. Well, these cedar shingles, especially from old growth, not only do they split clean, but again, as mentioned, they've got that anti-rot compounds that give it a really long life. So sometimes those shingles can last 100 years on people's roofs. So they really carry a premium value, and for that reason, they're still sought out. So super cool tree, one of my absolute favorites out here. This is a true cedar. So in the cypress family, we've got another eastern red cedar in this country that's out on the East Coast. That's actually not a true cedar. It's actually in the juniper family. So very cool to see. Just figured I'd pause and point that out. And one other thing that's catching my eye up here. So if we move just up the trail, there's a really cool plant up here that I see a little bit of a grove of. Let's actually hop over. There's some over here on the right-hand side of the trail, but there's an even better fruiting or flush of this awesome plant over here. So check this out. This is one of my all-time favorite plants out here in the forest. I oftentimes associate this primarily with older growth, and a lot of times with these cedar trees. So you can see these are all growing at the base of additional cedars. So, and if we look up, we can see that there's this whole little patch of this thing This is a really, really cool native plant that's known as the vanilla leaf. Achlys triphylla, I believe. So this one, notice that it's got kind of these like lobed, you know, the leaves come in three. We've got these long petioles that grow from the base of this. So pretty simple plant construction, right? We've got this single long stem or stalk and these three leaves or leaflets that come off of this. Now you'll also notice on some of these, let's actually take a look over here. Yeah, so you can see what's the start of a little flower stalk. So in time, this is gonna bloom and it'll be a simple white flower. It's not gonna have any petals or sepals, but it's gonna have a bunch of white stamens. And that genus name, Achlys, means mist. So it's thought that that's derived from, you know, the flowers that this bears. But let's get back though to the basics on this one. So it's one of those ones that anytime I'm in a forest and I see this plant, I feel automatically like I'm in a very special place, because again, I don't tend to see this in younger forests. It's more one that I see in rich, moist soil of older growth. And these leaves, so obviously from that common name, you might infer that these leaves have a vanilla scent, right? Vanilla leaf. But what's interesting, if you were to pick this right now, you would detect no amounts of vanilla. At least I can't when I smell this fresh. But if you were to take this home and dry it out, as it starts to dry and age and mature, it will have the most pleasant vanilla aroma. And this has been used for a very long time amongst indigenous peoples and modern folks as an insect repellent. So this will repel flies, mosquitoes, different things. It's common to take a little bundle of this, dry it out, and then it would oftentimes be hung in doorways to kind of ward off these different insects or mosquitoes or the like. I've also used it just even hiking, you know, like this can be something that you can kind of rub on your arms if you're entering dense mosquito territory or a particularly bad season up in the mountains. This can be a really effective insect repellent. So such a cool plant out here. And one of my all-time favorites. If you haven't smelled this, you know, again, I would only really harvest this if you saw it in abundance. It's worth noting that underneath, these are growing from rhizomes that basically snake through here. So if you do harvest it, you would just want to be careful not to actually pull it up. And again, you would want it to be a pretty nice flush of this plant, similar to what we're seeing here. So, you know, I wouldn't feel bad harvesting a couple of these sets of leaves. We can see over here too, this is a really good example of this flower coming up here. There's that little flower head. Let's see if I can get it to zoom here on that. But you can see that it's not quite showing its true colors yet, but it will very soon. So such a cool plant. After the flowering process, it will bear some dark brown to like, you know, reddish purple berries. Those are actually the fancy name for those, achenes. So those are just one-seeded fruits that will come out later in this plant's life. But really cool one. Keep your eyes peeled if you're out here in the Pacific Northwest. This is one of my all-time favorite native plants, and again, worth interacting with. Such a cool one. Moving just up the trail here, if I peek back here, I see the fruiting of a really interesting mushroom that's catching my eye back here. Now, for whatever reason, oftentimes when I get this guy on film, the fluorescent yellow color of this doesn't really pop as brightly as it does in person, which is an interesting phenomenon. I don't know exactly why that is, but from a distance, I can already tell that this is a Hypholoma. So it's in the Hypholoma genus. This is what's commonly referred to as the Sulfur Tuft. Let me squeeze in here and let's take a look. So this mushroom always grows from dead or decaying wood. And you can see that it's got this bright yellow color. if I give this a little bit of a tug and we investigate, so you notice that it's growing in this clump or cluster. If we look underneath here, we see kind of a whitish color, but you can also see some of that kind of bright fluorescent yellow. If I pull out, right here I've got a 365 nanometer UV light. Let's give this a little bit of a hit and see what it looks like under that light. So check this out. Just incredible. So this one is, again, so the color that it's picking up is even duller than what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is a bright fluorescent that's coming off of these gills, as well as, you know, the cap also will fluoresce a little bit, but primarily on the underside of this, just a beautiful fluorescent green. This is one of the signatures of this sulfur tuft, and it's worth being able to differentiate this from its edible counterpart, Hypholoma capnoides. So this particular mushroom, it's interesting. It contains some pretty nasty toxins that if you were to consume this on accident, it's one of those ones that would make you really, really sick. So it's a good one to be aware of, but always a beauty. And this will fruit oftentimes in abundance. Again, you can't necessarily see the wood underneath, but if we dig underneath, it's a guarantee that this is fruiting from dead or decaying wood. So that's what these saprophytic mushrooms, or these saprobes, this is the way that they do it. So the conifer tuft, which is an edible look-alike to this, will only grow on conifer. This one could grow on conifer or hardwood, so it can grow on either one. And boy, it can be tricky to differentiate those sometimes. So if you happen to have a UV light, again, this one's 365 nanometers, great way to be able to differentiate that. And cool to think that when we shine that on here and we see that fluorescing, that's actually the electrons being excited and jumping up into higher states and then coming back down to their resting state. So if you remember taking a high school or college chemistry course and you learned about electrons and different excited states as they jump to different orbitals, these are some aromatic carbon rings that contain electrons that are jumping to excited states and then back down to resting states, which causes it to fluoresce or give off this kind of neon fluorescent color. So super cool to see. Always love encountering this one out here. Again, that's the sulfur tuft, Hypholoma fasiculare. And just up here on the side of the trail, we've got a cluster of a really cool mushroom that we just saw an older version of a little bit ago. So this is what's known as the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. And take a look at this. So if I peel this back, you can see this is a really distinct look at this. So you can see these stout little boletes. The Xerocomellus genus of boletes are what are typically referred to as the suede boletes. And the reason why is if you feel this fresh young cap, it's got like very small little felty hairs that feel like suede. And so you'll also notice that with this particular one, this has sort of a bumpy surface, right? So it's got these little like nodules or bumps in the surface. It still has that felty kind of feel that's typical of Xerocomellus. But this is one of the things that differentiates it from some of the other similar looking boletes. So, you know, and this is only recently described, this deep purple bolete. Prior to recently, recent DNA sequencing and different analysis has really differentiated this from what we would typically have referred to as the Zeller's bolete, which apparently is a lot more rare and kind of confined or limited to the coastal area. So whereas this deep purple bolete is quite common. So we see a nice little cluster of 3 of those back here, and then we see under here an older one. This older one I'm going to go ahead and pull up. So you can see a little red color underneath the surface. You can also see underneath we've got a yellow kind of spongy pore surface, and sometimes we'll see a little lighter color on along that outside rim, although when that's really pronounced, that can be a sign that you're looking at the Zeller's bolete. So anyhow, this is a great edible mushroom. It's kind of got a little bit of a lemony flavor or taste. I'm gonna go ahead and harvest these and have a nice little side to tonight's dinner. So cool to find out here. I'm seeing some more too. As I pan up here, you can see a really small one fruiting out. So I might even poke around and just see if there's more to be had out here. But very cool to see. Again, that's the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. So check this out. As I was looking around and just kind of exploring to see if I could find any more of these deep purple boletes, look what I encountered just up beyond this little stump and at the base of this Doug fir log. This kind of caught my eye. And boy, this is just fascinating to me. Let's zoom in, let's take a look. So check this out. This is one of those deep purple boletes. And we can see that it's resting just like so. And these are the incisor marks of some kind of little rodent, whether that was, you know, a mouse or rodent of small stature or a small squirrel, you know, perhaps a Douglas squirrel or something. Super interesting to me because they left the actual cap, clearly ate away all those pores, or the spongy little pored surface that's its spore producing structure, and left the rest of it, which I find to be fascinating. So super interesting to see. If you know anything about that, critters eating these deep purple boletes and why they go for the sponge layer rather than the cap, let me know in the comments. Super cool to see. I just wanted to take a quick second to give pause up here. So check this out. So we were referencing earlier, these panther caps, Amanita pantherinoides, are really out right now. So much so that I feel like I'm tripping over them out here in the forest. So again, we've got partial veil or annulus around the stipe. If we dig down and we look underneath, we see that cup, remnants of the universal veil or vulva that covered that or enclosed the entire mushroom before it started to do its thing. Also note that we see these distinctive white warts or little bumps up on the cap. You can see on this one that a lot of those have kind of been washed off by the weather that we've had, the rain that we've been getting. And it's important for all of you to recognize that those white dots or warts that are up on the cap are not always present. So take for instance this little one right over here. It would be easy to look at this, and because it doesn't have those characteristic bumps or warts, it would be easy to just assume that this is not the panther cap. But lo and behold, as we look underneath, you see that distinctive vulva or cup that it's growing from, which pins this one as a definite Amanita. And it's something that, boy, as someone out foraging and looking for mushrooms, a lot of deadly toxic mushrooms are in this Amanita family. So it's really good to be able to identify those. Don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but just wanted to highlight that so y'all can see it doesn't always have those kind of characteristic warts on the cap. Cool to see though. Panther cap, Amanita pantherinoides. Often when I'm roaming the forests of the Pacific Northwest in search of mushrooms, this is kind of the typical type of spot that is just the stuff of dreams. So I'm surrounded by Douglas firs and western hemlocks, which tend to have a lot of strong ectomycorrhizal associations with a lot of the mushrooms that I'm oftentimes seeking out, especially in the fall time. But as we look up this slope, you can see that it's almost like this little carpet of moss, right? And we see really distinct plants worked in here. This is rattlesnake plantain, a super cool native plant out here. Lots of salal, some huckleberry. And this is just the type of habitat or environment that really is optimal for mushrooms all times of year, right? But especially if I'm seeing these even in the spring, I'll kind of make this mental note of it. This is a spot where I can absolutely see, you know, chanterelles and boletes and other mushrooms that I love to find. You can see these popping up right here. It's also worth noting that this mossy little carpeted surface is on a slope. And it's really advantageous oftentimes if you're mushroom hunting to be working upslope, because that gives you a really good kind of perspective or field of view where you can kind of catch the profile of a lot of the mushrooms that may be popping out just through the surface layer of this moss. So super cool to see. And again, right now today I'm seeing some, alpine jelly cones, Panaeolus alpina. I'm seeing a lot of Amanita pantherinoides in here, which makes sense because that's associated also with these Douglas firs. So, there aren't necessarily choice edible mushrooms that I'm seeing in here right now, but I'm making note of this spot because I could definitely see that changing come fall time. So cool to see. Just wanted to pause to kind of let you in on kind of my angle of viewing this territory and just some things to think about while you're out in the forest poking around and exploring. As I continue to work up this kind of mossy little forest slope, here's the call of the bald eagle in the background, and just stumbled across this. So this isn't particularly one that I'm on the lookout for, but since I see it fairly often, I like to point it out to viewers in case you're observing this as well. So this is in the Inocybe group, which is a fairly kind of fairly complex group of mushrooms that can be difficult to distinguish. This is a Nolanea, so it's in the Nolanea genus. I want to point out that the cap, notice how we've got this lighter brown color and we see those slight striations. We can tell this has been out for a while and perhaps it was wet but started to dry out a little bit. We describe this as a hygroscomelous cap. So when it changes color due to just differences or changes in moisture content. So these are going to have a silky kind of flimsy stipe that's oftentimes quite long, right? If we look underneath this, you'll see here, let's set this down so that you can kind of get a look. Yeah, so we see a light pink spore color showing up or registering on those gills. It may be difficult to see. Sometimes it can just look like a light brown color. But if you really look closely, or if you were to take this home and do a spore print, you'd see those light pink spores. So generally speaking, there are a lot of toxic pink spored mushrooms that are in this genus. So this is a good one that if you have any doubts, I would leave pink spored mushrooms alone in our Pacific Northwest forest and just admire them here. The one exception to that is the deer mushroom, which is Pluteus cervinus, which we featured out here. That one's not at the top of anyone's list that I know, kind of tastes like radishes. That's also a pink spored mushroom that is edible and is relatively easy to differentiate from these Nolaneas. But again, something that I don't tend to harvest any of those, just because for one, I don't enjoy that deer mushroom, and I know that a lot of these Nolaneas are toxic, so cool to see. Just moving up this mossy, kind of idyllic little slope, we see the remnants of one that we've been seeing quite often out here. This is what's commonly referred to as the alpine jellycone, Panaeolus alpina. And you can see that this is kind of getting a little bit dried out. I think of this as more an early spring or even a late winter site out here. So these are definitely on the tail end. This one's sometimes referred to as the poor man's gumdrop, for the simple fact that when it's fresh, this one can be plucked right off the sticks and twigs that it tends to cover all over the forest floor. One of the unusually rare mushrooms in the simple fact that it's one that can be munched on raw. So cool to see out here. This is obviously not one that I'm even considering consuming. It's a little bit past its prime, and but still a beauty and always fun to admire. So all over this moss-covered forest floor, I'm seeing a lot of these little remnants of these diggings. Surely the work of the Douglas squirrel, also sometimes referred to as the chicory. And you know, come late winter, early spring, they're oftentimes digging up truffles. And as I look up here, this is another sure sign of the Douglas squirrel. So you'll see this Doug fir cone. You can recognize it by these little, sometimes they're described as rodent tail looking little things that come out from the scales. And we can see all up in here, there's a collection or a little midden, right, of these Doug fir scales. And so I just wanted to pause to kind of check that out, but also wanted to admire this. So we've got this deep hole growing at the base of a Douglas fir, and this is kind of an old stump that's kind of rotted away and served as a nurse log of sorts. But look at what we've got growing in here. I just thought this was so cool. We've got this little clump or cluster of mushrooms that have found their home kind of down in this little recessed cave of sorts. Cool spot. It's amazing to see where these mushrooms end up finding suitable spots to call home. So cool to see. I'm not 100% sure of what species we're looking at, but I just thought that was really cool, so figured I'd throw it up there. Cool to see. Moving just down the trail here, we've got a pretty common sight out here in the Pacific Northwest. Check this out. So growing off a deadwood here, we've got this dark orange, brown, kind of funnel-shaped mushroom. If I pan up here, you can see a couple more of these. This is quite common out here, and if we investigate this, I'm gonna reach underneath, give this a little tug, and boy, as my fingers grasp this stipe, it is really a very firm, woody surface. Notice that this is not a gilled mushroom, this is a polypore. It's pored, and we can see those pores beginning to travel down this stipe. It's also got this dark colored, really distinctive stipe or base to this. What we're looking at here is typically referred to as the black-footed polypore, Piscipes batius. Very common sight out here, and boy, you can really see those pores. Let me zoom in just a little bit more so that you can see how finely pored that surface is. And again, distinctive kind of black stipe or base. Last week we featured one that looked very similar to this and was certainly related, same genus, but a different species. So cool to see out here. Again, that's the black-footed polypore, Piscipes batius. And if we look a little further down the trail, we see, boy, just an abundance of beautiful green. We've got the bleeding hearts, bracken fern, salmonberry, all kinds of wonderful mosses. We've got the native trailing blackberry here, which is my favorite. Definitely trumps the kind of introduced Himalayan blackberry, which is somewhat invasive out here, but also kicks out a good edible berry. It's got nothing on the trailing blackberry, but check this out. Look at this fruiting. Here's my hand for scale. Just massive fruiting of oyster mushrooms. This is in the Pleurotus genus. If we look underneath, we see those decurrent gills running clear down the stipe to the base of this one, where it attaches to what is surely a red alder log. So these are very common. They're in abundance out here right now. And boy, I'm seeing them just all over the place on hardwood. So of course, this is a choice edible. I tend to not harvest it when it's at this size because this can be a quite buggy mushroom, even in its best scenario at youth. But at this age, this thing is very likely to be pretty well infested with different forms of insect life, which, you know, grubs and all kinds of little bugs and stuff. So this is actually, as we've referenced in videos past, very high in protein. It's actually a carnivorous fungi. One thing that we haven't talked about in recent videos, though, that's worth mentioning is that this one also is quite medicinal. And a lot of times it's not admired or respected for its medicinal capabilities, but you know, there have been several studies on this suggesting that it is quite beneficial to human health. In Christopher Hobbs's book, Medicinal Mushrooms, which if you haven't checked that book out, it's a phenomenal resource. He talks quite a bit about the immunomodulatory properties of this, and also cites, several studies that have been done that have looked at its kind of effect in treating things like diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes. Several studies have been done where they've provided, I think it was 3 to 4 grams of this. I don't know if it was, I think it was a powdered extract, right? So this contains a lot of beta glucans, just like other wild mushrooms that we oftentimes forage out here. And they administered that along with some glucose. And over the course of a couple weeks in this one particular study, they noted that blood sugar levels dropped by, I believe, around 15%. And at the same time, insulin levels increased by over 20%. So kind of interesting. So probably still more questions than answers in terms of specifics around medicinal application of this. But, it's good to remember that a lot of these edible mushrooms that we view strictly as food sources also carry with them a ton of medicinal benefits. So this one is also anti-inflammatory and anti-allergic. And so, it'll really help oftentimes with different things that ail us. So I love the idea of treating our food as medicine. So good to remember that when we're consuming a lot of these awesome wild edible mushrooms, we also may be getting some other health benefits that we may not initially be aware of, but boy, I love looking into the research and the studies and just trying to suss out exactly what's going on when we consume these guys. So super cool to see. This is the oyster mushroom, Pleurotus genus, really out in abundance right now. So if you're here in the Pacific Northwest, check those big leaf maple logs and logs just like this, the red alder log. Those are the ones that I tend to see this one really kind of performing on. So get out there, see if you can find this one. Joy to see and pleasure to bring home to the table. This one again, I feel it's a little past its prime. I'm gonna kind of let it do its thing out here and spread its spores, and maybe I'll find it when it's a little younger next year. Keep my eyes peeled, probably find some more today. Cool to see. Boy, and all up and down the trail here, look at this carpet of just a really cool plant. This is the false lily of the valley. Such a beauty. Let's zoom in and take a look. Boy, this is one of those ones that I always admire just kind of what this does, the aesthetic of the forest. You can see it just blanketing the forest floor, as it tends to do in these moist, rich soil environments in the understory here. Cool to see. So I'm just out here on the side of the trail and I'm taking a quick sec. I brought a bag with me, as I typically do, and I'm taking some time to harvest one of my favorite wild greens, chickweed. If you missed last week's video, check it out. So I do a real close-up kind of ID portion of that video to help you be able to identify this one. But one of my absolute favorites. We've also got some Siberian miner's lettuce back here. I might harvest a little bit of that as well. I'm gonna go ahead and chuck that into the bag, and then in a second, we'll add some stinging nettle to the mix as well. Fun to be out here harvesting these greens while they're here. So gotta get them in the spring. This is when they're good. So definitely, if you're spending time out in the forest, don't forget to make time to spend with these plants. Awesome to see. And growing just up here on the side of the trail, we've got a plant that we checked in on a couple videos back. Really cool plant. This is Sweet Cicely, and we can see that it's got these furry stems. This is in the carrot or parsley family, so there's a lot of different toxic plants that are in this family. So it's not one to rush out and forage without really kind of careful and proper ID. This Sweet Cicely is going to have an anise or licorice type smell when the leaves are crushed. And I notice as I look up this little slope, I've got quite a bit of this all throughout this area. And this is one that typically a lot of times people will forage this And they may add these greens to a salad or something, but oftentimes what they're typically after is actually the roots. So this is one that I wouldn't forage unless it were really in abundance, and it certainly is in this particular spot. So I'm just going to kind of reach down here, and I'm going to give this a little bit of a tug. And notice as you look at this, this is kind of what we're after, is this root of this plant. Now I'm just going to harvest one of these guys just to kind of give it a taste. I'm kind of curious to add this to a tea and make a tea out of it. So I figure I'll take this home, I'll throw the greens into a salad, add that little anise flavor, but then I'm also really curious to experiment with the roots. This is not one that I've worked with extensively in the past, but as referenced in a previous video, my buddy was really kind of excited to point this out, and something that he admires every spring. And seeing as how this is not one that I've really given proper attention in the past for whatever reason, figure no time like the present. So cool to see out here. I'm excited to add this to my foraging collection here for the day and to give it a taste later this evening or in the days to come. Cool to see. Sweet Sicily. Moving just down the trail here, boy, we've got a really cool ground cover plant that's common out here in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. This is what's typically referred to as broad-leaved starflower. In the not so distant past, this used to be referred to as Trientalis latifolia. It's now been changed. And we can see on this, we've got this real distinct. This particular flower has 6 petals. It's worth noting that this can change. I believe it can be anywhere from, say, 5 to 9 petals. Same thing goes for these leaves. So this one has 4, but if you look around, you'll notice that some of these will have varying numbers. So for instance, if we look back here at this one, we've got 5 leaves and still 6 petals on that flower. But this is a really interesting one. It also goes by several different common names. So sometimes I think it's called chickweed wintergreen and various other common names, but super cool to see out here. This is one that historically was sometimes harvested by indigenous peoples for the tuber that is growing underground at the base of this. So it was sometimes consumed as food. But this is one of those ones that I see it often, and for whatever reason, I haven't given this one a try. I think it's one that I just enjoy seeing too much. So I've never been one to just gravitate towards harvesting it necessarily, although I am curious. So if you've made use of this and you've consumed that tuber, I'd be curious to hear about your experience. I've only read about it as a historical use, but I haven't necessarily consumed it myself. But boy, super cool to see out here. Love coming across this one, and it's looking particularly beautiful this time of year when these flowers are just budding out and starting to really do something to add some splendor to these mossy forest floors. So cool to see out here. Broad-leaved starflower. So it's worth noting that as I come through the forest here and continue to harvest this stinging nettle, I just wanted to talk real quickly about where I'm choosing to harvest it from. So for one thing, this plant, it is known to accumulate heavy metals. So you want to be kind of particular, just as is the case with a lot of mushrooms. You don't want to necessarily go out and harvest this from the side of the road. You're liable to kind of pick up some heavy metals in there that you may not want to consume, especially if you're going after the roots, which have different, medical or medicinal, I should say, capabilities. But more often than not, what I'm after are the leaves or the greens of this. And so what I'll typically do is I'll come through, and what I'm most interested in harvesting is just this fresh top of this. So I'll oftentimes come in here and I'll get just underneath this area and I'll snip it right there. Now, what'll happen is that this thing will, as it continues to grow, it's going to shoot out 2 new growth from this little node where these leaves branch off, it's going to actually form two heads. So it's actually going to start to grow in a different pattern, and it's actually going to produce more stinging nettle than we would otherwise have, which is kind of a cool way to harvest this, right? You can come back for more after it kind of re-sprouts from that top, or you can just let it do its thing and develop its own little field of stinging nettle out here. But I just figured I'd point that out real quick. And again, you want to be conscious of where you're harvesting this from, because that's one thing that we want to avoid, is consuming heavy metals. So cool to see out here. I'm filling a bag with this, and again, as referenced earlier, my plan is to dry out most of it and consume it in the form of infusions. Super cool. Moving just up the trail here, we've got a mushroom that I'm not seeing quite as often these days, just due to the change of the season. We can see an old one that's kind of dried and withered up over here, and then we've got another one that's losing its color on its cap. You can see slight striations on the margin, and then this looks like to have a bit of a hygrophonous thing going on, right, where it's just kind of aging and changing color a bit. If I give this a little bit of a tug, what you're going to notice is underneath we've got reasonably spaced gills. I was expecting to see them be a little bit more decurrent, or running down the stipe a little bit more. We can see slight evidence of that, but you know, to confirm the identity of this completely, I'm gonna go ahead and give it a sniff. Yeah, and it's got a really distinct anise scent or aroma to it. This is what's typically referred to as the fragrant funnel. This is Clitocybe deceptiva. Now it's worth noting that the fragrant funnel, Clitocybe fragrans, is another common one that's out here that typically it's pretty difficult to differentiate these in the field, but you know, recent DNA sequencing has come back with a lot of the ones that were thought to be Clitocybe fragrans actually registering or showing up as Clitocybe deceptiva. So we'll go with that for now, but again, common name fragrant funnel I would apply to both species, and they've both got that really unique licorice or anise scent underneath. It's a dead giveaway. Cool to see. And just up here on the side of the trail, you can see a really cool example of something that I was describing earlier. So we've got our friend, the stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, and we can see that this particular one has been either foraged or consumed by, say, the likes of a deer or something. And you can see that it was cut or bitten off right above this node where these two leaves came out. You can see the new growth is actually starting, and it's kicking out two individual stems from that point. So this is a really cool thing to know when you're harvesting stinging nettle. If you harvest it, just that young top portion of this, you'll actually get a growth pattern that's going to give you more yield that you can come back to later in the season. So kind of a cool thing to know, just something to keep in mind as you're out here foraging and collecting stinging nettle. Don't forget to come back. Cool to see. And check it out, just up here on the side of the trail, we've got another one of these. These rodents are just loving these deep purple boletes. They're really kind of going to town on these, and very characteristic, right? The way that they're eating away that sponge layer and like kind of the lower flesh of that mushroom, but leaving the cap, but they're eating the stem and sponge. So pretty interesting, cool to see out here. I love picking up on those little recurring patterns and themes out here. So awesome to see. And moving just up the trail here, boy, we've got another very characteristic fruiting of one that we've been seeing a lot of. This, of course, the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus, atropurpureus. No shortage of this out here. And as we've been seeing, I've been enjoying this one, and so have some of the rodents out here. We can see quite a flush here. This one's a little older once it starts to curl up at the margin there. Not as interested in that. And sure enough, back here, we see some as well. We can see that characteristic kind of bumpy cap. Sure, it's got that little hairy, felty feel of the suede boletes, but it's also got a slight little purple hue and a bit of a bumpy texture on it. So cool to see out here. If you're here in the Pacific Northwest, really be on the lookout for these guys. They're easy to miss, but they're really out right now and they make a great spring edible. So I love seeing these out here. I might go ahead and harvest a few more of these and add them to the pot. Cool to see. And boy, this is pretty remarkable. So check this out. So we've got this nice fruiting right here. And then as I move further up the trail, notice we've got a great big Doug fir, some hazelnut and whatnot. And just as I start to really look, I'm seeing them everywhere. So there's one as we look or investigate further underneath this fern. We see there's another one. There's one that's kind of blown out a little bit, hiding underneath that star flower. But boy, there is just no shortage of these right now. And the more that I kind of scour the surface out here, especially in relation to these Douglas firs, I start to really see them popping out. And you can see even more of them here, right? And there's another one as we start to peel back some of this understory. So really interesting. I mean, they're just out and about doing their thing. So if you're looking for some good edible boletes, I would recommend really kind of be glued to the forest floor. Seems like especially underneath these reasonably or decent sized Douglas firs, that seems to be the ideal places where I'm really seeing these popping up. So I'm going to continue to just kind of pick the young prime ones. Again, these older ones that kind of get a little blown out, I'm less interested in something like that. But if we look further down and we see these really young ones that are still that dark deep purple in color, those are the ones that I'm kind of after. So cool to see, and just figured I'd point that out. Certainly out here in abundance, so cool to see. And I just couldn't resist throwing in a few quick photos from last night's incredible display of Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. All these photos were just outside my front door, and boy, serves as such a tremendous reminder of just how much magic is going on right outside our front door all the time. Some of it we can see, some of it we can't, but it's always happening. Until next time, happy trails.